It was the summer of 2012 when I decided to take a break from the chaos of city life. I'd been working long hours at a high-stress job, and the constant noise, pollution, and endless stream of people had worn me down to the point of exhaustion. My therapist suggested I take some time off, disconnect from the world, and find a quiet place to recharge. That's how I ended up renting a cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. In the evening, the sun would be at the highest point, and it would be brilliant. The cabin was advertised as a secluded retreat, perfect for someone looking to escape the hustle and bustle of modern life. It was nestled in a dense forest, miles away from the nearest town, and promised complete isolation. The listing mentioned no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbors for miles. It sounded like exactly what I needed. I arrived at the cabin on a warm afternoon in late June. The drive had been long and winding, with the last stretch of road being little more than a dirt path through the trees. The cabin itself was small but charming, with a wooden exterior that blended seamlessly into the surrounding forest. It had a cozy front porch with a rocking chair, and the inside was furnished with rustic handcrafted furniture. The air smelt of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. I unpacked my things and spent the first day settling in. I had brought enough supplies to last me a week, including food, water, and a stack of books I'd been meaning to read. As the sun set, I lit a fire in the stone fireplace and sat by the window, watching the shadows grow longer and the forest grow darker. For the first time in months, I felt at peace. But that peace didn't last long. The first night, I was woken by a loud banging noise. It sounded like someone was pounding on the front door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened. The banging came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural growl. I froze, unsure of what to do. The cabin was supposed to be completely isolated, so who, or what, could be outside? I grabbed the flashlight I had brought with me and crept to the front door. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob, but I forced myself to stay calm. I took a deep breath and opened the door, shining the flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing there. The porch was empty, and the forest beyond was silent. I stepped outside, scanning the area with the flashlight, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened, before finally going back inside and locking the door. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a raccoon, and tried to go back to sleep. But the banging came again, this time from the side of the cabin. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, but again there was nothing there. The banging continued, moving around the cabin, as if whatever was outside was circling me. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed awake, clutching the flashlight and listening to the banging as it moved around the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard whispering outside, but I couldn't make out the words. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted and on edge. I spent the day trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, the banging started again. This time it was accompanied by a high-pitched screeching sound that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, but the noise was too loud, too persistent. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the window, determined to see what was out there. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the darkness, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural ways. Its skin was pale and almost translucent, and its eyes, if you could call them that, were black voids that seemed to suck in the light. It was standing just outside the cabin, staring at me with a twisted grin on its face. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, even through the glass. I wanted to run, to hide, but I was frozen in place. The banging started again, louder and more frantic, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the figure wasn't alone. There were more of them. I could see their shadows moving in the darkness, circling the cabin like predators stalking their prey. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I could make out words now. Words that sent a chill down my spine. Let us in. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually, the banging stopped. The figures disappeared into the shadows, and the forest fell silent once more. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the cabin, clutching the flashlight and praying for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I packed my things and left the cabin as quickly as I could. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I was miles away from that cursed place. I never told anyone what happened that night, and I never went back to the cabin. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear the banging, the whispering, and the sound of those things outside, waiting for me to let them in. I didn't plan on ever going back to that cabin. After what I experienced, I wanted to forget it ever existed. But life has a funny way of pulling you back to places you'd rather leave behind. A year after my terrifying ordeal, I received a package in the mail. It was a small, nondescript box with no return address. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a note that simply read, "You need to know the truth." The journal was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was neat but faded, as if it had been written decades ago. As I flipped through the pages, I realized it was a diary, a record of someone else's experiences in the same cabin I had stayed in. The entries were dated from the summer of 1978, and as I read them, a sense of dread began to creep over me. The first few entries were mundane, descriptions of the cabin, the forest, and the peacefulness of being so far from civilization. But then the tone changed. The writer, a man named Thomas, began to describe strange occurrences, footsteps outside the cabin at night, whispers in the trees, and a feeling of being watched. It was eerily similar to what I had experienced. As I read further, the entries became more disturbing. Thomas wrote about seeing figures in the woods, tall, thin creatures with pale skin and black eyes. He described them as not human, but not entirely animal either. He tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, but the encounters became more frequent and more intense. The creatures would circle the cabin at night, banging on the walls and whispering to him they wanted him to let them in. The final entry was the most chilling. Thomas wrote that he had discovered something buried beneath the cabin, an old rusted metal box. Inside the box was a collection of bones and a strange symbol carved into the lid. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt a deep sense of unease just looking at it. The last sentence of the entry sent a shiver down my spine. "They're coming for me. I can hear them outside. I don't think I'll make it through the night." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. I didn't know who had sent it to me or why, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I had to go back to the cabin. I had to find out what was buried beneath it. The drive back to the cabin felt like a nightmare. Every mile brought back memories of that night. The banging, the whispers, the figures in the darkness. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to me like a shadow. By the time I reached the dirt path leading to the cabin, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. The forest seemed darker than I remembered, the trees leaning closer together as if they were conspiring to block out the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine, but there was something else too, a faint metallic smell that made my stomach churn. I parked my car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my feet the only sound breaking the silence. The cabin looked exactly as I had left it. The wooden exterior was weathered but intact, and the forest around it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled in the wind. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I grabbed a shovel from the trunk of my car and approached the cabin. The journal had mentioned that the metal box was buried beneath the floorboards in the living room. I didn't know if I'd be able to find it, but I had to try. The thought of digging up whatever was hidden beneath the cabin filled me with dread, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being drawn back here for a reason. The inside of the cabin was just as I remembered it. Cold, dark, and filled with the lingering sense of dread. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. I moved the rug in the living room and began prying up the floorboards with the shovel. The wood was old and brittle, and it didn't take long before I had a hole large enough to climb into. The space beneath the cabin was cramped and filled with dirt and debris. I shone my flashlight around, searching for any sign of the metal box. The beam of light flickered slightly and I shook it, hoping it wouldn't die on me. The last thing I needed was to be stuck in the dark beneath the cabin. It didn't take long to find the box. It was exactly as Thomas had described, rusted and covered in dirt, with a strange symbol carved into the lid. The symbol looked like a series of interlocking circles, with jagged lines cutting through them. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, and it filled me with a deep sense of unease. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out and pulling the box from the ground. It was heavier than I expected, and the metal was cold to the touch. I carried it back up into the cabin and set it on the table. My heart was pounding as I stared at it, my mind racing with questions. What was inside? Why had it been buried beneath the cabin? And who, or what, had put it there? I took a deep breath and pried open the lid. Inside was a collection of bones, small, delicate, and unmistakably human. There was also a piece of parchment, folded neatly and tucked beneath the bones. I unfolded the parchment with trembling hands. The writing was faded, but I could still make out the words. It was a ritual, a set of instructions for summoning something. The words were written in a language I didn't recognize, but there were notes scribbled in the margins, in English. The final line sent a chill down my spine. Once the ritual is complete, they will come. Do not let them in. I didn't know what to do. The journal, the bones, the ritual. It was all too much. I felt like I was being pulled into something far beyond my understanding. Who had performed this ritual? And what had they summoned? The thought of those figures outside the cabin, the ones with the black eyes and twisted grins, made my skin crawl. Were they the result of this ritual? And if so, why were they still here? I sat down at the table, my mind racing. The cabin was silent, but I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see one of those figures staring back at me, but the glass was dark and empty. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed the box and the journal, stuffing them into my backpack. Whatever was going on, I wasn't going to figure it out alone. I needed help. But before I could make it to the door, I heard it, the banging. It started softly at first, like a distant drumbeat, but it quickly grew louder. The whispers followed, echoing through the cabin like a chorus of voices. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze in place, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The banging was coming from all around me now. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, trying to crush me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could make out words now. Words that sent a chill down my spine. Let us in. I grabbed the backpack and ran for the door, but it was too late. The figures were already there, standing in the shadows just beyond the porch. Their black eyes stared at me, and their twisted grins sent a wave of terror through my body. I slammed the door shut and locked it, but I knew it wouldn't hold them for long. The banging grew louder, and the door began to shake in its frame. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I needed a plan. I couldn't stay here. They would get in eventually. I glanced around the cabin, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. The shovel was still by the hole in the floor, but it wouldn't be much use against whatever those things were. My eyes landed on the fireplace, and an idea began to form. If I could start a fire, maybe I could keep them at bay, or at least buy myself some time. I grabbed the matches from the kitchen and began piling logs into the fireplace. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely strike the match, but after a few tries I managed to get the fire going. The flames crackled and leapt to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The banging outside grew louder, and I could hear the sound of splintering wood as the door began to give way. I grabbed the backpack and backed into the corner of the room, clutching the shovel like a weapon. The door burst open with a crash, and the figures stepped inside. They moved slowly, their long limbs twisting and bending in unnatural ways. Their black eyes locked onto me, and their grins widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I swung the shovel at the closest figure, but it passed right through them as if they were made of smoke. They didn't even flinch. Panic surged through me as I realized I was completely defenseless. The figures closed in, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, and the smell of decay filled the air. Just as I thought it was over, the fire in the fireplace roared to life, the flames leaping higher than I had ever seen. The figures turned toward the fire, their grins faltering for the first time. The flames seemed to repel them, forcing them back toward the door. I didn't know how long it would last, but I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. I grabbed the backpack and bolted for the door, shoving past the figures as they recoiled from the fire. I didn't look back as I ran for my car, the whispers and banging fading behind me. I threw the backpack into the passenger seat and started the engine, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely grip the wheel. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still visible in the distance, the flames from the fireplace casting an eerie glow through the windows. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the dirt path, watching me drive away, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with black eyes and a twisted grin. It raised one long, spindly arm and waved. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that cursed place. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped. Not really. The box, the journal, the ritual, it was all still with me. And I had a horrible feeling that those figures weren't done with me yet. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, a small, sleepy place called Black Hollow. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone and strangers stuck out like sore thumbs. I checked into a motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the rooms smelled like mildew and the sheets were scratchy, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. I locked the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands still trembling. The backpack with the metal box and the journal sat on the floor, and I couldn't bring myself to open it again. But I knew I couldn't ignore it. Whatever was in that box, whatever those figures were, I needed to understand it. I needed to know why they were after me. I took a deep breath and reached for the backpack. The metal box was cold to the touch, even through the fabric. I set it on the bed and opened it, carefully removing the bones and the parchment. The bones were small and fragile, like they belonged to a child. The thought made my stomach churn. Who had done this? And why? I unfolded the parchment and studied the ritual again. The instructions were written in that same strange language, but the notes in the margins were in English. They were cryptic, but I could make out a few phrases. Summon the Watchers, offer the sacrifice, and do not let them in. There was also a warning. Once the ritual is complete, they will come. Do not let them in. I didn't know what any of it meant, but I had a sinking feeling that I was in way over my head. I needed help. I needed someone who knew about this kind of thing, someone who could tell me what I was dealing with. But who? I didn't know anyone who believed in this kind of stuff, let alone someone who could help me. I pulled out my phone and started searching for local paranormal investigators or occult experts. It felt ridiculous, but I didn't know what else to do. After a few minutes of searching, I found a name. Dr. Evelyn Hart, a professor of folklore and mythology at a nearby university. Her bio mentioned that she specialized in obscure rituals and supernatural phenomena. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead I had. I sent her an email explaining my situation in as much detail as I could without sounding completely insane. I didn't expect a response, but to my surprise, she replied within an hour. She agreed to meet with me the next day. The next morning I drove to the university, the metal box and journal tucked safely in my backpack. Dr. Hart's office was in an old ivy-covered building on the edge of campus. She was waiting for me when I arrived. a tall, elegant woman in her late 50s with sharp features and piercing green eyes. She greeted me with a warm smile, but there was a seriousness in her expression that made me feel like she already knew more than I had told her. I sat down in the chair across from her desk and placed the metal box and journal on the table. She studied them for a moment before speaking. "Tell me everything," she said. I did. I told her about the cabin, the banging, the whispers, the figures with the black eyes. I told her about the journal and the ritual. She listened intently, her expression growing more and more grave as I spoke. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. "What you're describing," she said, "sounds like a summoning ritual for something called the Watchers. They're ancient entities, older than humanity itself. According to legend, they exist in a realm beyond our own, and they can only enter our world through specific rituals. Once summoned, they're nearly impossible to banish." My heart sank. "So, what do I do?" Dr. Hart leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "The first thing you need to understand is that they're not after you. They're after the box. The bones inside it are the remains of the sacrifice used to summon them. As long as you have the box, they'll keep coming for you." "But why?" I asked. "What do they want with it?" "The box is a tether," she explained. "It binds them to this world. If they can reclaim it, they can use it to open a permanent gateway between their realm and ours. And if that happens, well, let's just say it won't be good for anyone." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So what do I do? Destroy it?" Dr. Hart shook her head. "It's not that simple. The box is protected by the same ritual that summoned the Watchers. If you tried to destroy it without breaking the ritual first, it could make things worse. You need to perform a counter ritual, one that will sever the connection between the box and the Watchers." "And how do I do that?" I asked, my voice trembling. She reached into her desk and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "This is a grimoire," she said, handing it to me. "It contains the counter ritual you need, but be warned, it's dangerous. If you make a mistake, you could end up summoning something even worse." I took the book, my hands shaking. "Why are you helping me?" Dr. Hart's expression softened. "Because I've seen what happens when these things get out of control. And because I believe you're the only one who can stop them." I left her office with the grimoire and a heavy sense of dread. The counter ritual required specific ingredients: herbs, candles, and a few other items I didn't even recognize. Dr. Hart had given me a list, and I spent the rest of the day tracking everything down. By the time I returned to the motel, it was late, and the sun had already set. I set up the ritual in the center of the room, following the instructions in the grimoire as carefully as I could. The candles cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs. I placed the metal box in the center of the circle and began to chant the words of the counter ritual. At first, nothing happened, but then the candles flickered and the air grew cold. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. I could feel the presence of the Watchers, their black eyes watching me from the shadows. I kept chanting, my voice trembling but determined. The box began to shake, the metal groaning as if it were alive. The whispers turned to screams, and the shadows in the room began to twist and writhe. I could feel the Watchers trying to break through, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. But I didn't stop. I kept chanting, pouring every ounce of strength I had into the words. The box shook violently, and then, with a deafening crack, it split open. The bones inside crumbled to dust, and the whispers faded into silence. For a moment, everything was still. And then the candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat in the dark, my heart pounding, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the room remained still, the air heavy with the scent of burnt herbs and the faint, lingering chill of the Watcher's presence. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The metal box lay in pieces on the floor, the bones reduced to a fine grey dust. The candles were extinguished, their wicks blackened and cold. I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I set the flashlight down. Had it worked? Had I actually severed the connection between the box and the watchers? The grimoire had warned that the counter-ritual was dangerous, but it hadn't explained what would happen if it succeeded, or if it failed. For all I knew, I had just made things worse. I reached for the grimoire, flipping through the pages to see if there was any mention of what to expect after the ritual. But the book was silent on the matter, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and instructions that made my head spin. I closed it and set it aside, feeling more lost than ever. The motel room felt suffocating, the walls closing in on me. I needed to get out, to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The parking lot was empty, the only sound the faint hum of a streetlight buzzing overhead. I walked to the edge of the lot and leaned against a fence, staring out at the dark silhouette of the forest in the distance. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The cabin, the journal, the ritual, it all felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And now, with the box destroyed, I didn't know what to do next. Were the Watchers gone for good? Or were they still out there, waiting for another chance to break through? I didn't have any answers, and the uncertainty was eating away at me. I needed to talk to someone, to get some kind of reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. I pulled out my phone and dialed Dr. Hart's number. It rang several times before she picked up. "Hello?" Her voice was calm but guarded. "It's me," I said, my voice shaking. I did the ritual. The box is destroyed. But I don't know if it worked. I don't know if they're gone." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said. I recounted the ritual in as much detail as I could remember. The candles, the chanting, the way the box had split open. When I finished, there was another long pause. "It sounds like the ritual was successful," she said finally. "The destruction of the box would have severed their connection to this world." But what?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "But the Watchers are ancient and powerful," she said. "They don't give up easily. If they were summoned once, they can be summoned again. And if they find another tether..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew what she was going to say. If the Watchers found another way into this world, they would come back. And next time, I might not be able to stop them. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to be vigilant," she said. "Watch for signs of their presence, whispers, cold spots, unexplained phenomena, and if you see anything at all, call me immediately." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Thank you," I said. "For everything. Be careful," she said before hanging up. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and stared out at the forest. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. For a moment, I thought I saw something move among them. A tall, thin figure with black eyes. But when I blinked, it was gone. The next few days passed in a blur. I stayed in the motel, too afraid to go back to the cabin or even leave town. I spent most of my time researching the Watchers, scouring the internet for any information I could find. But there wasn't much. Just a few obscure references in old folklore and mythology. According to the legends, the Watchers were beings from a realm beyond our own, entities that existed outside of time and space, that they were said to be both ancient and eternal, their motives inscrutable and their power unimaginable. The more I read, the more I realized how little I knew. And the more I realized how little I knew, the more afraid I became. The Watchers weren't just some random spirits or ghosts. They were something far more dangerous, and I had no idea how to protect myself from them. On the third day, I received a package in the mail. It was small and wrapped in brown paper with no return address. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, half expecting to find another metal box or a set of bones. But inside was a small, intricately carved wooden pendant on a leather cord. There was a note attached. "Wear this It will protect you. And E, I recognized the initials immediately. Dr. Hart. I slipped the pendant over my head, the wood cool against my skin. It didn't feel like much, but I hoped it would be enough. That night, I had my first dream about the Watchers. I was back in the cabin, standing in the living room. The fire was burning in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else. Something metallic and sharp. I could hear the whispers again, faint but growing louder with each passing second. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding. The banging started, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I knew what was coming, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my feet rooted to the floor. The door burst open, and the figures stepped inside. They were taller than I remembered, their limbs longer and more twisted. Their black eyes locked onto me and their grins widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. They moved toward me, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators stalking their prey. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figures closed in, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. I could feel their cold breath on my skin, the smell of decay filling the air. And then, just as they reached for me, I woke up. I was drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The motel room was dark and silent, but I could still feel the presence of the Watchers, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. I reached for the pendant around my neck, clutching it tightly as if it could protect me from the nightmare. But deep down I knew the truth. The Watchers weren't gone. They were still out there, waiting, and they weren't going to stop until they found another way in. The dream left me shaken, but I couldn't afford to dwell on it. I needed to keep moving, to figure out my next steps. Dr. Hart's pendant hung around my neck, a small but comforting weight, though I wasn't sure how much protection it could really offer. I decided to stay in Black Hollow for a while longer. The town was quiet, and it felt safer than going back to the cavern or returning to the city. But as the days passed, I began to notice something strange. The people in Black Hollow were off. They weren't unfriendly exactly, but there was a tension in the air, a sense of unease that seemed to hang over the town like a fog. When I went to the diner for breakfast, the waitress avoided eye contact, her hands trembling as she poured my coffee. At the gas station, the clerk stared at me a little too long, his expression unreadable. Even the children playing in the park seemed subdued, their laughter hollow and forced. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. After everything I'd been through, it was easy to feel paranoid. But the more I observed, the more I realized that something was wrong. The town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the Watchers. One afternoon I decided to visit the local library. If there was any information about the Watchers or the history of the area, that would be the place to find it. The library was a small brick building on the edge of town, its shelves lined with dusty old books and faded newspapers. The librarian, an elderly woman with silver hair and glasses perched on the end of her nose, greeted me with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for information about the history of the area," I said. "Specifically anything about unusual occurrences, legends, folklore, that kind of thing." Her smile faltered for a moment, and I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or suspicion. But she quickly recovered, nodding and leading me to a section of the library filled with old, leather-bound books. "You might find what you're looking for here," she said, "but I should warn you, some of these stories aren't for the faint of heart." I thanked her and began flipping through the books. Most of them were filled with the usual local history, stories about settlers, logging, and the founding of the town. But as I dug deeper, I began to find references to something darker. There were mentions of disappearances, strange lights in the forest, and whispers of a curse that had plagued the town for generations. One book in particular caught my attention. It was an old handwritten journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The entries were dated from the late 1800s, and they were written by a man named Samuel Black, one of the town's founders. As I read through his entries, my heart began to race. Samuel wrote about a group of settlers who had come to the area seeking a new life, but soon after they arrived, strange things began to happen. Livestock went missing, crops withered, and people began to disappear. The settlers blamed it on the harsh conditions, but Samuel believed there was something more sinister at work. He wrote about hearing whispers in the forest, about seeing figures with black eyes watching him from the shadows. He described a ritual, one that he claimed could summon ancient beings from another realm. According to Samuel, the settlers had performed the ritual in a desperate attempt to gain power and protection, but instead, they had unleashed something far worse. The final entry was the most chilling. Samuel wrote that the beings, the Watchers, had demanded a sacrifice. The settlers had refused, and in retaliation, the Watchers had slaughtered them, one by one. Samuel was the only one who survived, and he vowed to keep the Watchers' existence a secret, fearing what would happen if they were ever summoned again. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. This wasn't just a local legend. It was real. The Watchers had been here before, and they had left a trail of death and destruction in their wake. But why had they returned now? And why had they chosen me? I needed to talk to someone who knew more about the town's history. I approached the librarian, holding up the journal. "Do you know anything about this?" I asked. She glanced at the journal, her expression darkening. "Where did you find that?" "It was on the shelf," I said. "Do you know if any of it's true?" She hesitated, then sighed. "Come with me." She led me to a small, dimly lit room at the back of the library. The walls were lined with old photographs and documents, and there was a musty smell in the air. She gestured for me to sit down, then took a seat across from me. "The stories in that journal, they're true," she said. "Or at least, some of them are. The Watchers have been a part of this town's history for as long as anyone can remember, but most people don't talk about them. It's forbidden." "Why?" I asked. "Because the Watchers are real," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And they're always watching. If you talk about them, if you acknowledge them, they'll come for you." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do they want?" "Power," she said. "Control. They feed on fear and despair, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it." I thought about the cabin, the ritual, the figures with the black eyes. "What happens if they find another tether?" I asked. She looked at me, her expression grave. "Then they'll come back, and this time, they won't stop until they've taken everything." The librarian's words lingered in my mind long after I left the library. The Watchers weren't just a local legend. They were a part of the town's history, a dark secret that had been buried for generations. And now, they were back. But why? What had changed to bring them out of the shadows? I spent the next few days digging deeper into the town's history, searching for any clues that might explain the Watchers' return. The more I learned, the more I realized how deeply intertwined the Watchers were with Black Hollow. The town's name itself was a clue. Samuel Black, the founder, had named it after himself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was also a reference to the darkness that had plagued the town from the beginning. I found old newspaper articles about unexplained disappearances, strange lights in the forest, and even a few accounts of people claiming to have seen the Watchers. But the most disturbing discovery came when I stumbled upon a hidden room in the basement of the library. It was tucked away behind a false wall, its entrance concealed by a bookshelf. Inside, I found a collection of artifacts, old ritual tools, handwritten notes, and a large leather-bound book that looked like it had been sealed shut for decades. I carefully opened the book, its pages crackling with age. It was a grimoire, much like the one Dr. Hart had given me, but this one was far older and more detailed. The pages were filled with intricate diagrams, symbols, and instructions for rituals, some for summoning, others for banishing. And then I found it. A ritual specifically designed to summon the Watchers. The ritual was eerily similar to the one I had found in the metal box. It required a sacrifice, human or animal, and a series of symbols to be drawn in blood. The notes in the margins were written in Samuel Black's handwriting, and they described the ritual in chilling detail. According to Samuel, the ritual had been performed once before by the original settlers, and it had unleashed the Watchers on the town, but there was something else. A warning, written in bold, shaky letters. Do not perform this ritual. The Watchers are not to be summoned, they are not to be trusted, they will take everything. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words. The Watchers had been summoned before, and the results had been catastrophic. But why had someone performed the ritual again? And who had done it? I needed answers, and I knew there was only one person who might have them. Dr. Hart. I called her, my hands trembling as I explained what I had found. You need to come back, she said, her voice urgent. Bring the grimoire. We need to figure out who's behind this and how to stop them. I packed up my things and drove back to the university, the grimoire tucked safely in my backpack. Dr. Hart was waiting for me when I arrived, her expression grim. She led me to her office and closed the door behind us. Show me what you found, she said. I handed her the grimoire and she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the text. Her expression grew darker with each page, and when she finally looked up, there was a deep worry in her eyes. This is bad, she said. Very bad. Whoever performed this ritual knew exactly what they were doing, and if they've summoned the Watchers again... She didn't need to finish the sentence. I knew what it meant. The Watchers were back, and they were more dangerous than ever. What do we do? I asked. Dr. Hart leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. We need to find out who performed the ritual and why, and then we need to stop them before they can do any more damage. How do we do that? I asked. We start by looking for patterns, she said. The Watchers don't just appear out of nowhere. There's always a reason, a tether, a summoning, something that draws them to this world. If we can find out what that is, we might be able to break the connection. I thought about the metal box, the bones, the ritual. What if they've already found another tether? I asked. Dr. Hart's expression darkened. Then we're in trouble. But we can't give up. We have to keep fighting. We spent the next few days poring over the grimoire, searching for any clues that might lead us to the person behind the ritual. It was slow, painstaking work, but eventually we found something. A name. Written in the margins of one of the pages. Elias Black. Elias Black? I asked, looking up at Dr. Hart. Who's that? She frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. I'm not sure, but the name sounds familiar. Let me check something. She pulled out a stack of old books and began flipping through them, her eyes scanning the pages. After a few minutes, she let out a low whistle. Elias Black, she said. He was Samuel Black's son. According to the records, he disappeared under mysterious circumstances shortly after the town was founded. There were rumors that he had been involved in something dark. Do you think he's the one who performed the ritual? I asked. It's possible, she said. But if he did, why now? And why would he summon the Watchers again? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for sure. We needed to find Elias Black. If he was still alive, he might be the key to stopping the Watchers. Dr. Hart and I spent the next few hours digging through old records and archives, searching for any information about Elias Black. The more we uncovered, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Elias wasn't just Samuel Black's son. He was the one who had continued his father's dark legacy. According to the records, Elias had been obsessed with the Watchers, believing they held the key to ultimate power. He had spent years studying the rituals, even going so far as to experiment with them in secret. But his experiments had gone horribly wrong. The Watchers, once summoned, had turned on him, demanding more and more sacrifices. Elias had tried to stop them, but it was too late. The Watchers had taken control, and Elias had disappeared, leaving behind only a trail of death and destruction. So Elias is the one who brought the Watchers back, I said, staring at the old, faded photograph of him that Dr. Hart had found. He was a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a grim expression. He looked like someone who had seen too much, someone who had been broken by the darkness. It's possible, Dr. Hart said. But if he's still alive, he's been hiding for a very long time. And if he's the one who performed the ritual again, we need to find him before it's too late. Where do we even start? I asked. He could be anywhere. Dr. Haas hesitated, then pulled out a map of the area. There's an old black family estate on the outskirts of town. It's been abandoned for decades, but if Elias is still alive, that's where he'd be. It's the only place left that's connected to the family. I felt a chill run down my spine. The thought of going to the Black Estate filled me with dread, but I knew we didn't have a choice. If Elias was there, we needed to confront him and stop whatever he was planning. The Black Estate was a crumbling mansion at the edge of the forest, its once grand facade now overgrown with ivy and moss. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was oppressive. As we approached the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Dr. Hart pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly. The inside of the mansion was dark and musty, the floors covered in a thick layer of dust. The walls were lined with old portraits of the Black family, their eyes seeming to follow us as we moved through the house. We searched room after room, but there was no sign of Elias. Just as we were about to give up, we found a hidden door in the basement. It was concealed behind a bookshelf, just like the one in the library. Dr. Hart and I exchanged a glance before pushing it open. The room beyond was small and dimly lit, the walls covered in strange symbols and diagrams. In the center of the room was a table, covered in candles and ritual tools, and sitting at the table was a man. Tall, gaunt, and eerily familiar. It was Elias Black. He looked up as we entered, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. His face was pale and drawn, and he looked like he hadn't slept in years. But there was something else in his expression, something dark and dangerous. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice low and raspy. "You've been meddling in things you don't understand. We're here to stop you," Dr. Hart said, her voice steady. "Whatever you're planning, it ends now." Elias laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "You think you can stop me? You think you can stop them? The Watchers are already here, and they're hungry." I felt a chill run through the room, the air growing colder with each passing second. The candles flickered, their flames casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. And then I saw them. The figures with the black eyes, emerging from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now you'll join the others." The Watchers emerged from the shadows, their tall, spindly forms twisting unnaturally as they moved. Their black eyes locked onto us, and their twisted grin sent a wave of terror through my body. The air grew colder and the whispers began, low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Dr. Hart grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "Stay close," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to get out of here, now." But before we could move, Elias stood, his gaunt frame blocking the door. His hollow eyes gleamed with a mix of madness and triumph. "You think you can escape?" he rasped. "The Watchers have already claimed this place. There's no way out." I glanced around the room, my heart pounding. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, and the candles flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows. The Watchers were closing in, their movements slow but deliberate, like predators savoring their prey. Dr. Hart reached into her bag and pulled out a small pouch. She opened it, revealing a handful of coarse salt and dried herbs. "This might buy us some time," she said, her voice low, "but we need to break the ritual. If we can disrupt the symbols, we might be able to weaken their hold." I nodded, though my hands were shaking. "What do I do?" "Distract them," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "I'll handle the symbols, just stay alive." Before I could respond, she threw the salt and herbs into the air, chanting something under her breath. The Watchers recoiled, their twisted forms writhing as if in pain. Dr. Hart darted toward the wall, her hands moving quickly to smudge the symbols with a piece of chalk she had pulled from her bag. I turned to face Elias, who was still blocking the door. His grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "You think you can stop them?" he sneered. "You're nothing but a fool." I didn't have a plan, but I knew I couldn't let him stop us. I grabbed one of the candles from the table and hurled it at him. The flame caught his sleeve and he stumbled back, his grin faltering as he tried to pat out the fire. I used the distraction to shove past him, my heart racing as I bolted for the door. But the watchers were faster. One of them lunged at me, its long, spindly fingers brushing against my arm. I felt a searing cold where it touched me, as if my skin had been frozen. I stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to keep moving. Dr. Hart was still working on the symbols, her hands moving frantically as she chanted under her breath. The watchers turned their attention to her, their black eyes narrowing. One of them reached for her, but she threw another handful of salt and herbs, forcing it back. "Almost there," she shouted, her voice strained. I grabbed a heavy candlestick from the table and swung it at the nearest watcher. The candlestick passed through its form as if it were made of smoke, but the creature hissed, its grin faltering for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy Dr. Hart a few more seconds. Finally, she stepped back, her face pale but determined. "It's done," she said. "The ritual is broken." The room seemed to shudder, the symbols on the walls fading as if they'd been erased. The watchers let out a collective hiss, their forms flickering like a dying flame. Elias screamed, his voice filled with rage and despair. "No, you can't do this. They'll destroy us all." The watchers turned their attention to him, their black eyes gleaming with malice. They moved toward him, their twisted grins widening as they closed in. Elias tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The last thing I saw before Dr. Hart pulled me out of the room was the watchers surrounding him, their forms twisting and writhing like shadows in the dark. We ran through the mansion, the air growing warmer as we moved further from the basement. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. When we finally burst through the front door, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. I collapsed onto the grass, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Dr. Hart sat beside me, her face pale but calm. "It's over," she said. "The ritual is broken. The watchers are gone." "But what about Elias?" I asked, my voice trembling. She shook her head. "He's gone too. The watchers took him. He's one of them now." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't say anything. We sat there in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. The watchers were gone, but the memory of their presence would stay with me forever. The days that followed were a blur. Dr. Hart and I returned to the university, where she worked to document everything we had discovered. The Black family's dark legacy, the watchers, the ritual. It all became part of a carefully curated archive. A warning for anyone who might stumble upon the same path. I stayed in Black Hollow for a while, though the town felt different now. The tension in the air had lifted and the people seemed lighter, as if a weight had been removed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the watchers were still out there, waiting in the shadows. The translator Hart gave me the pendant before I left. "Keep this," she said, "just in case." I nodded, though I hoped I'd never need it again. As I drove away from Black Hollow, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest stretched out behind me, dark and endless. For a moment I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, tall, thin, with black eyes. But when I blinked, it was gone. The watchers were gone. But I knew they'd always be with me, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of our world.